Once again, I am rather limited for choices for Letter Q. I hate to admit it, but this is my first time properly playing Quake II. Sure, I've dipped into it once or twice and I've watched videos about it, and I'm also aware of its legacy, but I've never played the actual game beyond the first 30 seconds or so. And man, have I been missing out! Quake II seems to follow the first Quake in name only. Well, name and gameplay, but we'll get to that. Where the first one was all about eldritch Lovecraftian horrors and was a bit of a mishmash of different ideas, Quake II takes a leaf out of Doom's book. What you get on starting the game is a nice cutscene showing once again the power of the cd-rom, which details the adventures of a space marine company that crash lands on the surface of Mars. At least I think it's the surface of Mars. There's so much radio interference that I wasn't altogether sure. Anyway, all that's basically forgotten as soon as you take control of this lone space marine. From here on out, your job is to shoot anything that moves. It definitely carries over the mechanical feel of Quake I and sharpens it a little. Everything feels a bit less floaty and a bit more precise than it did last time. But you still have very similar fast-paced movement, very similar jumping, and very similar feeling weapons. Let's talk the weapons actually. In my limited playtime I come across a decent selection. The blaster is the starting weapon and it's probably the least satisfying gun I've ever used in an FPS. It's slow, it feels weak, it sounds like a mouse having a fart, and it barely does enough damage to take out the first few enemies. Fortunately, it's supplanted by the shotgun very early on, which is a nice crunchy piece of hardware. It was, as was the norm back then, my main go-to weapon. The super shotgun is like the shotgun, but bigger and crunchier. It jibs enemies like they're made out of papier-mâché, but it also chews through ammo, so be careful. The machine gun is a lot of fun to use. You want to stun like everything in sight? Now this is the shooty gun for you. Once again, ammo is a bit of a concern. Finally, the grenades. They're a bit hard to use. What can I say, I've been playing a lot of Halo lately. There was a good variety of enemies as well. They presented a decent challenge, but they weren't too overwhelming, I thought. The flying robots made for a nice change of pace, even if they were a little like the gargoyles from Heretic. One question though, how come they can see underwater and I can't? Speaking of Heretic, Quake II seems to have gone to the same interior designer as they did. Everything's gone back to that very exciting mix of brown and grey. The original Quake was extremely brown as well, and it's a bit of a tragedy that the textures weren't more interesting. Again, maybe they improve later on in the game. And that's about all I have to say thus far. Quake II kind of marks the end of an epoch for a certain style of game. Wolfenstein, Doom, Heretic, Duke 3D, Blood, all their technological advancements led up to this game. It stands as a culmination of the FPS of the 90s, and the last word in shooters that were made purely for the action, something that we wouldn't see much of again for at least another decade. Every major FPS beyond this point takes a different approach to first-person shooting. Half-Life pushes narrative to the forefront, Deus Ex gives us an RPG in shooter's clothes, Thief is the opposite altogether, and even Quake 3 is basically multiplayer only. Even many of today's throwback shooters have things like weapon upgrades and skill trees, with exceptions of course. Verdict: what, no map?